Welcome to another day of tactics. So this is the last slide we left off. So I won't get too deep. Is someone trying to come in? Too deep in the discussion on these again. We're going to actually pick up where we left off. Jonathan Gingrich actually brought up a lot of thought-provoking questions on the last one, right? So we were talking about the unborn may be human, but they're not persons. And basically what's going on in this slide is we're bringing up any kind of some various objections that people will bring up to Christians, right? So morals just invention of culture, and then what you're going to see is that there's a form of Columbo number 2. So was anyone here last week? I think this might be an entirely new clue. Okay, so Columbo number 2 is a follow-up to Columbo number 1. Anyone remember what Columbo number 1 is? Oh, you're good. Thank you, Tim. Anyone remember what Columbo number 1 is? Good. Yeah, what do you mean by that? So, and that's the first question that you want to ask people if they bring up some sort of challenge. The one that I keep bringing up just because I want you guys to kind of think up other ones, and so I'm just going to give the same one every time, and then we're going to kind of have other ones. I just want to steal yours, is what I'm trying to do. But Christians are a bunch of science deniers, right? So what do you mean by, how would you phrase a what do you mean by that type of question if someone brings that charge against you? Anyone think of one? Christians are a bunch of science deniers. So they're calling you a science denier, basically.
Why do you think that? I mean, it's kind of along the same lines, but...
You're actually jumping ahead to today's class. So
Sorry.
No, it's good. It's good. You're thinking about it. So the purpose of this, you're just trying to gather information about their view. Which I feel like I'm splitting hairs when I do that. Think of the what do you mean by that question like the what, whereas the one we're going to learn today is the why, right? So you kind of said why, right? So why do you think like that? So you're looking towards their rationale when you say that. The first one that we're talking about is you're just trying to understand what their view is. So what a good example of Columbo number 1 for that would be, what do you mean by science? Or what do you mean by science denier? What do you mean by I deny science, right? And then the second question for that would be, well, how'd you come to that conclusion that I deny science? Why do you think that, right? So that would be the kind of sequence of what, try to figure out, what their view is, and then once you know what their view is, ask them, well, how'd you get that view? Where'd that come from, right? And so all of these, responses are all examples of Columbo number 2, right? So where you're asking them, what was their rationale? So someone says, moral is just an invention of culture. Okay, well, what's your evidence for that? And there's some cue words that you're going to realize are indicative of Columbo number 2. So one of them is evidence, right? So if you're asking for evidence, that's a Columbo number 2, right? If you're asking for reasons, that's a Columbo number 2. If you're asking a why type question, why do you believe that? That's a Columbo number 2. So there's 1,000 different ways that you can phrase Columbo number 2. So anytime that you're asking for a rationale or evidence, anything like that, you know that you're asking a Columbo number 2 type question. And so all of these, I didn't dwell too much on the responses because they're all kind of the same, right? So can you give me reasons why you think that's true? People are born homosexual. Well, what's the scientific evidence that homosexuality is genetic? And then the last one here was where we kind of got caught up for a little bit. So I figured we would hash it out, especially because the next slide is really coming back to that subject, right? The unborn may be human, but they're not persons. And so Jonathan Gingrich because something happened the week before in Alabama, right? So where they were talking about, in vitro fertilization, they kind of, ruled that they were persons. And so Jonathan was actually bringing up some thought-provoking questions because so now for tax deductions, what do we do with about that? Because now you have 5, potential humans that, are just embryos that you can just file for tax deductions for. And so I wanted to hash that out a little bit because, what are the implications then for IVF or for embryos in general? What's going on in that situation, right? So we're actually going to frame this in the context of stem cells, but it's really going to touch upon the same issue, right? Because this is specifically targeting embryonic stem cell research. Now, for those that were here 2 weeks ago, we actually had, was it 2 weeks ago or last week? I can't remember. But we had a discussion between two guys. So we had John and James, right? So John was advocating for embryonic stem cell research, and James was questioning it, right? So just in case some of us weren't here for that class, let me just kind of go to that story. So this is kind of the interaction between John and James. So John says, the president is so foolish. He's withholding funding for embryonic stem cell research. James says, isn't embryonic stem cell research immoral? And John says, you haven't been listening to those religious pro-life people, have you? They're such extremists. James says, well, what's extreme about saying embryonic stem cell research is wrong? And John says, because stem cell research would really help a lot of people. James says, but doesn't stem cell research kill innocent human beings? John says, you think embryos the size of a period at the end of this sentence are human beings? And James says, sure, they're human beings. John says, no, they're not. They're just protoplasm. James says, yes, they are. They're every bit as human as you are. John says, no, they're not. They're only potentially human. And James says, they're already human. John says, I disagree. You and I are human beings. An embryo is different. So that kind of just gives some context for what's going on there. We kind of talked about that interaction in depth in the last class, so you can always listen back, in the YouTube videos that I post online if you want to listen to that. What we're going to focus on today is just this last part of the exchange between James and John, because at this point there's really nothing substantial happening there, right? They're just trading assertions. So James is saying, sure, they're human beings. John's saying, no, they're not. They're just protoplasm. James says, yes, they are. No, they're not. Yes, they are. It's just you're going in circles there, right? So not getting anywhere because no one's actually refuting the other person's statement. They're not providing evidence to actually say that their statement is legitimately wrong for some reason, right? And so what I'm going to ask you guys is, what is a question that a good Columbo number 2? Remember, how'd you come to that conclusion? What would be a good Columbo number 2 question for John to ask James? So John is the guy who's pro embryonic stem cell research. James is the one that's against it. Who's got one? Take a crack at it.
What's your evidence that embryos are not human beings? Would that be
James asking John. Yes.
Yeah.
So now, what would John want to ask James?
What's your evidence that embryos are human beings?
Right. It's just the inverse of that, right? So now, just to kind of flesh this out a little bit more, what do you think John would say if James asked him, how do you know that they're not human beings? Anyone got any ideas? Just to kind of put ourselves in that frame of mind. Right? So, right?
They're just a mass of cells, is what science tells us.
Okay. So now what would be some responses to that? We'll get to that in a little bit. Okay, so they don't have a heartbeat, just a mass of cells. Any other ones that they might bring up? We'll say like maybe one or two more. But there's a lot.
They always go that they're dependent on the mother.
Dependent on the mother.
They can't survive outside of the womb, so they can't. They're not fully human yet.
Because they can't survive outside the womb, right? So anyone? Well, let's go back to let's talk about James now. So with James, what would be his defense?
James is the pro-life guy.
Right.
I mean, that's the way humans all start. So scientifically, it is human. So you can't
Right.
say it's not. That is what they are. So
Right.
we're debating their value at that point.
Right.
We're not debating are they human because scientifically they are human.
Right.
From moment of conception,
From the moment of
it's every
conception.
qualification of life.
Even prior to the heartbeat being detected, which is very early, they're still human.
Says when I was formed in my mother's womb. Who's to say when that started?
Right.
Could have been when the egg and the sperm come together. That's
Right.
when you're formed.
Right.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. So that's all really good. Yeah. So we're going to break this down a little bit. So for James, there's two things, and you guys both covered this. We're just going to kind of really, get down to the nitty gritty of it. There's two things that we're going to want to know. If you want to be a human being, what do you have to be? If you're going to be a human being, what does it mean to be a human being?
We have the human DNA.
Right, so that's what makes you human, right? So that's what separates us from being a lizard or a chimp or, you know, a worm, right? Is that we have human DNA. Sure, we also look different, right? We don't have scaly skin, we don't have certain qualities, but that it always comes down to the DNA. That's what determines that. Ultimately, it comes down to God, right? That's, you know, what He's what gives us, imbues us with this DNA. But the DNA is that decisive, you know, feature that makes us into being human, right? But now, just being human, this might sound weird, isn't quite enough, right? Because certain types of humans, like dead people, get cremated, right? We don't cremate living human beings, right? And so to have the same rights that we all typically enjoy requires us to also be alive. Now, what does it mean to be alive? So scientists look at several different features to determine whether or not something is actually alive. First, not in this particular order, but these are what they are. So first, they have to metabolize, right? So they have to be able to metabolize energy, right? Which they do. So zygotes do that from day one, right? You can't grow if you're not metabolizing energy. Cells do this, right? When they look to, you know, Mars and what they're looking for, or when they look at, you know, in Antarctica at these cells that are able to live there in these extremely harsh conditions, these are not like extremely developed forms of life, but they do metabolize, right? They will admit this is a living thing. So when they look at that bacteria that's on Antarctica, or potentially when they're trying to look to Mars for life, they're not looking for, human beings or something with like an advanced form of life, fish. They're looking for bacteria, basically. So they have metabolism. They respond to stimuli. So zygotes do respond to stimuli. There are certain chemicals that are released into the womb from day one, platelet activating factor, that they respond to. So they respond to stimuli. They have the ability to reproduce. Now, this is kind of a funny one because if they mean like cellular reproduction, sure, that happens, again, immediately from day one. If they're talking about the capacity to have offspring, well, that must mean that they have the ability to eventually do that, because even a 7-year-old child doesn't have that actual ability yet. So it's a little like funny when you try to look this up online, but either way, it goes in favor of that the zygote does have this capacity. Heredity, we just talked about DNA, right? So it has heredity from the parental generation. Adaptation. So they adapt to the environment based on what's put into the womb, right? Depending on what the mother's eating. If she's nourished well, if she's not nourished well, it's going to adapt in a certain way. And again, this happens from day one. This is not. It doesn't gain the ability to adapt, 3 weeks in. It's adapting the whole time. Growth, obviously, you will not grow more than you grow from zygote to any other point in life. I mean, it's like a trillionfold, right? You think of how many cells are in a newborn infant. It's massive. So there's the most growth that you're going to do in your life is going to be during that time period. And then finally, cellular organization. So the cells are organized in the way that living cells are organized, with mitochondria, with nuclei, with ribosomes, with Golgi apparatus. All that stuff that is characteristic of living cells are in living things, right? So, which is all of these qualities are present in the zygotic stage, and 95% of biologists will affirm this. You have some that are kind of giving into a narrative, in my opinion, that will deviate, but this is something that's by and large accepted by the vast majority of science. So it's alive, and it's obviously human because they have human DNA. And that's what it comes down to. Now, if we return to John's argument, right, Caitlin was kind of giving the argument for that, which was that, heartbeat, potentially, they don't feel pain, and therefore they're not worthy of life. They're dependent on the mother. They can't feasibly live in outside of this environment. Anytime someone gives one of those qualities, you can always bring up a outside of the womb example of that, right? So doesn't have a heartbeat. There are people, actually, believe it or not, Katie will attest to this. She worked on a surgical ICU where people don't have heartbeats, right? And they have a machine that they're keeping them on. And so if you lose your personhood status as soon as you don't have a heartbeat, well, then we should just give up as soon as you go on ECMO, right? Which is that machine that keeps your heart beating. Pain, right? If you don't have pain, well, I guess if you have neuropathy, you have less value than someone who does not have neuropathy, or hypothetically someone that just doesn't feel pain at all, right? There are medical conditions that are anomalies, but they do happen, where people just don't feel pain. And so whenever you try to put something in addition to humanness as being the thing that qualifies you to have human life, you end up in a eugenic type philosophy where you think that there's something, and this is something that, I mean, any tyrant or despot that wanted to justify his genocide, that is what they would do. They would say, well, it's not quite enough that you're human or that you're alive. You have to have, white skin. You have to have blonde hair and blue eyes. You have to have, pick your quality. But that's what they do. And so, really, you want to reduce it to the two fundamental features that are common to all human beings, which is that we're human and that we're living, right? So, yeah. Any questions on that? Or it didn't take quite as long as when I was practicing this, I felt like I was just gonna end up dwelling on this subject a lot more. I think it's just because last week I got a little push. I don't know if I would call it pushback, but just some questions on the whole pro-life thing. But maybe we're all on the same page with that. So I don't need to give reasons. I always thought this is when I was kind of going through the book and I looked at this, I'm like, man, people say this, especially because I think the reason why this threw me for a loop is because that's what they always charge us of saying, right? They say that Christians oh, you don't need to give reasons, you just have faith, right? And so because it's an irrational belief system that you guys have, and they always give the image that this is always the thing that we're saying, right? And so I find the situation very ironic of them coming at me and saying this, but maybe it happens, right? So someone might say, I don't have to give reasons, I just believe it, right? And so really the simple response to that is probably the same response that they would give you if you said that you don't need to give reasons for your faith is, well, why would you believe something that you have no reason to believe is true, right? Because if you have no reason to believe it's true, then, then why would you hold that, right? So, these are all basically restatements of the same thing, but try to have them articulate why they don't need proof for their views. And like I said, because this is something that is often charged against us, you can say, well, why is it only that religious people need to give reasons for their views, but not non-religious people? That seems a little unfair, don't you think? Right? And so you can kind of just turn the tables on them pretty quickly with that. So the professor's ploy. So this is something that will happen occasionally in colleges. Actually, probably not occasionally, probably on a pretty regular basis. So the professor might say something like the Bible is just a bunch of fables, right? Kind of offhandedly says it, right? Doesn't really provide proof, and this can happen in various contexts. It can happen in a biology class, right, where they're talking about evolution or something like that. Can happen in sociology class, psychology, right? I mean, any of these classes, they can, talk about, the psychology of religious people or what have you, and it'll just come up, right? Now, I actually, ironically, was preserved from a lot of this. Now, I went to one of the more liberal institutions in the country. I went to University of the Arts. So art school, you can imagine, is laden with liberal ideology. But the thing is that they're hyper-focused on whatever the discipline that you're doing. So I was a music student, and I really, yes, I took some liberal arts classes, but that was not my focus at all. I was more focused on composition, I was focused on ear training, I was focused on those kinds of things. And so I had to take some liberal arts classes, but I just kind of did them to get them over with. Strangely, I was preserved, right? I actually didn't take in a lot of the liberalism that was being thrown around. And when I think back to those liberal arts classes, I can remember them kind of alluding to these kinds of statements, like the Bible is just a bunch of fables. I don't think they ever directly said that, but there was one class I took, it was a sociology class, and he was singing the praises of Sweden, how they had 70% taxes. Back then, I'm thinking, maybe that sounds kind of good, and I'm thinking now, I'm that's crazy. That's just 70% taxes. So obviously a very liberal, idea coming out of there. It's pretty much communism. Anyway, so bottom line is I was preserved. But I think there's a lot of people these days, and even when I was in college in the late the first decade of the 2000s, that this was already starting to happen. Right? And they'll make this charge, right? And they'll just say that the Bible's just a bunch of fables. Now, it might be tempting, if you're a Christian in this context, to say, well, no, they're not. I've got all this evidence that Jesus was resurrected, based on what the disciples did. And you might have all these forms of evidence that you're ready and willing to give. But don't do it, right? Because what's going to happen here is the teacher always has the power, right? So whoever the professor is can always take away that mic, right? If you start to say, to give the evidence for the resurrection or for the historicity of the Bible or whatever it is, they can say, oh, well, that's nice, Mike, but, and then he can just ridicule you, take the mic away. Everyone thinks that he won the argument and no such thing actually happened, right? So don't take the bait, right? What are our two tactics that we've learned so far? What are the two questions?
What do you mean by that?
And what's the second one? Someone other than Keith.
What's your evidence?
Right. How do you come to that conclusion? Right. But what you said, what's your evidence? That's I'm only using those two just because I'm trying to keep it uniform, but you can phrase it however you want, but that is basically what it is, yes. So we want to use our tactics in this situation, especially in the classroom setting. Why? Why would we, in the classroom setting, would we really want to remember those two tactics? Because, actually, I'm not going to say that. I'm going to see if you guys can identify it. If you can't, it's cool. I can. So in the classroom setting, the teacher is the one that's supposed to be giving you the information. As a student, you're just supposed to be the one asking questions and absorbing information, right? So the burden of proof is on the teacher all the time, right? Now, if a student for some reason makes a claim, right, then I guess the teacher can have him try to defend it. But that really shouldn't happen very often in the classroom setting because it's not the students that's making the claims, it's the teacher that's making the claims, and then he then has to back it up, right? So use your tactics. Okay, teacher, what do you mean by a bunch of fables? What does that really mean? Do you mean myths? Like exactly how are you defining fables? Is it still grounded in reality in some way? It's just changed over time? Is it completely fabricated? Is there really no bearing of truth in them? And have him define that, and then once he's defined it, it's just a bunch of myths, never even happened, right? Oh, okay, well, how do you come to that conclusion? What's your evidence for that, right? And then, at this point, we'll just kind of like pretend this is happening, and what might he do? He might start to get the inkling that maybe you're not on his side. Maybe you're, one of those crazy Christians, right? So what he's going to try to do is, I'm a charitable guy. I'm a fair teacher. It seems like you're one of those Christians. Why don't you explain to the whole world, like, 2 minutes, you can explain to the whole world, why Christianity is true and why the Bible is not a bunch of fables, and then we'll see what we think about it. What's he trying to do with that? What's he trying to do there? Anyone think about it? Just, see if you can identify what he's trying to do.
Aren't you going to have to explain yourself to the whole class?
What's that?
Aren't you going to have to explain your position or, do your tactics to the whole class rather than just one person? I assume this is in a classroom setting.
Right, this isn't a class. So you would then, instead of just having to use your tactics against one person, now you're going to have to do it against the whole class? That's right.
Which, if I may follow up, if this is in a classroom setting,
right,
I would argue that a better tactic is to say to the professor, teacher, when are your office hours? Can I set up an appointment to discuss that with you so that it's mono and not one you against the whole class?
Right.
I think that's a better tactic.
That's probably true. I would say that, yeah. If we're going to, preserve everyone's dignity and make sure that no one gets humiliated or anything like that, I think that's probably true. But just, barring that option, which I think is probably the best option, and you would then, I think, want to use your tactics in the mono setting, right? To preserve everyone's dignity, it's probably better to go that way. But let's just say that's not an option for whatever reason. The guy has no officers. I don't know. So what he's trying to do there is he's trying to put the burden of proof on you, right? So the burden of proof. Anyone remember from? I think it was 2 weeks ago. I don't remember. Burden of proof. Anyone remember what the burden of proof is?
Whoever makes the claim is supposed to happen.
Right. So whoever makes the claim now has to defend the claim, right? So has the responsibility to defend it. And the inverse of that is that if you haven't made the claim, you're not obligated to make any defense of anything, right? So because, and at this point, the student hasn't actually made a claim, right? He's just asking the teacher, how'd you come to the conclusion that that the Bible's a bunch of fables, right? So he's never said he's a Christian. He's never said that he doesn't believe that they're a bunch of fables. As far as the teacher knows, he just wants to know more, right? And so the student, you being the student, you don't have to defend your claim. What he's trying to do is he's trying to put that burden of proof on you, and you have no reason to bear it. And so don't let them do it, right? Just what you're going to gently and respectfully do is you're going to say, just in all due respect, teacher, I'm the student, right? You made a claim, and I really want to know more. I don't fully understand your claim. Can you just explain that a little further? It seems like you're saying that the Bible is a bunch of fables. This is new information to me, and I just really want to know why that is, right? We're in the university setting. I'm assuming you know more than me on this. And he might try to push it back again, and then you can finally, if you really want to shut it down, just like, I never made the claim. You don't know that I'm a Christian. I really just want to know more from you. And so anytime that they try to put the burden of proof on you, and this isn't just in the classroom setting, this is any setting. If you have not made the claim, there is no reason for you to bear that burden of proof. And so just kind of push it, put the ball back in their court by saying that you just want to know more about their view, or how they actually came to the conclusion that they did. So, anything else? Oh, yes.
Just an observation.
Mm-hmm.
When you're in a setting like that,
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't you know when you start challenging that the professor would come back at you? Wouldn't you just assume that you're putting yourself in that situation?
Wouldn't you assume? Oh, yeah,
Well, like, if you're going to challenge a professor, the nature, I would think, the nature would be he's going to challenge you back. Wouldn't you know that going in?
I don't know if I would call it a challenge. I mean, students are supposed to ask questions, right? So I don't know that I would. I mean, I guess it's a challenge because you're asking him how he came to that conclusion. And to a certain degree, you're going to expect him to challenge you back, but it's an inappropriate challenge because the rule is, and this is the rule, just a basic rule of, tactical, or what's the word I'm looking for, engagement with debates or arguments, is that if you haven't made a claim, you don't have to defend it. And so if you're just, and maybe I'm being a little too harsh in the way that I'm saying that this is supposed to go down, but you don't have to phrase it in a way that sounds combative, right? You can just say, can you clarify that for me? Like, just how do you know that's a bunch of fables? Or just phrase it as nicely as you can, but you're really just trying to pick his brain, which is really what's appropriately supposed to happen in the classroom setting at the universities. Remember, when I was in school for occupational therapy, something that we were called the crickets class because we would never ask questions. And it was like a bad thing. It was like a derogatory, a slur that was brought against our class. I mean, not really not that bad, but we're supposed to ask questions. They wanted us to ask questions, and I think that's what in these settings is supposed to happen. Now, the problem, I think, the reason why a teacher might get a little bit uptight about this is because they don't actually have a defense for it, and it was just an offhanded comment that they made. They weren't trying to center their whole class around this. They probably just wanted to teach on evolution or whatever, but they make this offhanded comment that they actually don't realize that they have no defense for, right? It's just something that they've absorbed from the zeitgeist, from the culture around them, and many times they don't have a defense for it, so they become defensive and try to push the burden of proof back onto you, which they might not even realize is inappropriate because you're not the one that made the claim. And so just try to keep that back in the mind. If you're not, as a Christian, because this goes outside the classroom setting where people will try to push the burden of proof onto you. They'll call you a crazy science denier. You feel like that you have to defend. No, I'm not a crazy science denier. And you'll try to give evidence to the contrary. They're the one that made the claim. They're the one that called you the crazy science denier. They have to give you evidence first as to how exactly you fit that mold. And then once they've done that, then you can respond to their view. But and like I said, try to do it in a gentle and charitable manner. That's kind of like just an ethic that's kind of underlying this class that sometimes can get lost because it sounds like we're being argumentative. But yeah, just try to remember, burden of proof goes on the one that made the claim. So, and then don't worry if you don't know where to go next. So let's just kind of bring these up. So, just because I want to cement this into your mind, first two Columbo tactics are what? First one is, what do you mean by that? So someone makes the claim that Christians are a bunch of haters. You ask, what do you mean by hater, right? And then secondly, how'd you come to the conclusion that we're a bunch of haters, right? So those are the first two. What's nice about the first two is that they're completely passive, right? This doesn't take any skill. And I know that sometimes, especially a class like this, believe it or not, I'm not the argumentative type. I know I'm the one running this class, and you're probably imagining that I just go around debating people everywhere I go, but I don't. And I'm actually more on the reserve side, generally speaking. Now, but the thing is that unfortunately, any one of us could end up in this situation, even if we're not looking for it. Someone they just find out that we're a Christian, and they say they just say something nasty to us, and we want to make some sort of defense for Christ. We're called to do that. And 1 Peter 3:15 says that we're to make a defense for those that ask us for the hope that we have. Right? It doesn't mean that we're being combative or argumentative in the sense that we're trying to win an argument necessarily. We're just trying to be good representatives of Jesus. Try to portray Christianity for what it actually is, not the caricature that the culture wants to give it. Right? And the nice thing about the first two Columbo questions is that they require no knowledge at all. And sometimes that's all you need. Like I said, in the classroom setting, if the teacher makes a charge that the Bible is just a bunch of fables, and you respond with those two questions of, what do you mean by fables? And then how'd you come to the conclusion that Christianity is just a bunch of fables? Sometimes what this can show, especially if the teacher doesn't really have a robust response to that, is that the teacher kind of made an empty claim. Right? And what that could show to the other students in the class is that maybe there's more to Christianity than I thought there was, or maybe there's more to creation theory than I thought that there was, and it can cause them to instead of thinking that evolution is an absolute fact, they might want to go home and research it a little bit, right? So sometimes the first two Columbo questions can actually go a long way. Now sometimes not, right? Sometimes they'll have a response to them, right? And our job now is to do a third form of Columbo, which we'll get to probably next week or the week after, which is using questions to make a point, right? So, but what this requires is for you to have some background knowledge on the subject, right? So if we go back to the abortion thing, right? So the first claim might be that Christians, I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head. I'm pro-choice, right? So I'm pro-choice. I love everyone, and I think everyone should have rights or whatever. And then you ask, well, what does it really mean to be pro-choice? What does it mean to have choice? And they'll say, well, it's the choice, freedom of the right to choose, right? And you can say, okay, let's further clarification. Freedom to choose what? And then eventually you'll get down the freedom to choose, the termination of a child. And okay, what is the termination of a child? That's killing the child, right? So you kind of take off all the semantic layers of that, right? And you get down to the crux of what they're actually saying, and you expose it. But you have to have some background knowledge first. You have to know what an abortion actually is in order to kind of what's called take the roof off of that argument. And that's what we're going to learn in future classes, not only with the pro-life context, but there's many ways in which those kinds of arguments come up. But it just requires a little bit of background knowledge on some of these subjects, and it's not necessarily a deep level of knowledge, but just something. And so kind of the bottom line here is that you don't always need to hit home runs, right? Sometimes just getting up to bat will do, and that's what these first two Columbos are meant to do, right? It's just kind of getting up to bat, kind of showing that you're willing to, ask some questions to see if you can kind of identify some of those flaws in their view, right? Because our conviction, right, which I really hold to, is that we believe in the truth, right? So Christianity is the truth. And so if Christianity is the truth, anything outside of that is not the truth. And so they're trying to hold up a lie, and if you ask enough questions, eventually the lie will expose itself. And it's just our job to try to, exploit that and identify it and exploit it. Okay, harvesting and gardening. I kind of talked about this a couple weeks ago. Do you guys remember the difference between harvesting and gardening? Yeah, so harvesting is just kind of when we reap someone to Christ, right? So when someone finally makes that decision. Another is, and gardening is kind of that whole process leading up to that. And it can be anything, really. It can be just simply saying that you're going to church or whatever. You're just planting the seeds that Christianity is still a thing and that it is, something valuable. And so I kind of went into greater detail in the past couple classes, so we're not going to dwell on that too much. Let's kind of get you guys used to using your Columbo number 2s. That's where I really wanted to focus this class. So see if you can come up with 3. That's what we did 2 weeks ago. Even if you just come up with 1, and I've got some stock ones here too, so if you can't really think of a good challenge to bring up, then just ask me. I've got a few of them. And what you're going to do is I really want someone to play the role of challenger and someone to play the role of defender, right? And really just because we're only going to have so much time where we're going to be able to do this. Once this class is over, it's really you guys in the world then. That's your practice. But right now we have this wonderful opportunity to practice on each other. And so I really want us to try to do that. So I want everyone to come up with at least one challenge. And what's going to happen is that the challenger is going to say the challenge, The defender is then going to respond to that challenge with their Columbo number 1 and Columbo number 2. What's Columbo number 1? What do you mean by that? Columbo number 2? Yeah, how'd you come to that conclusion? Right, so that's, so we're going to use those two, and we're going to tailor it to the challenge. So I'm going to bring up the example that I've been bringing up the past like 4 weeks. You know, Christians are a bunch of science deniers. Okay, so you ask, what do you mean by that, right? What do you mean by science denier? What I want the challenger to do is put yourself in the mind of the challenger, right? So why would someone say that Christians are a bunch of science deniers? Well, because you don't accept evolution as scientific fact, right? And then they're going to say, well, okay, how'd you come to the conclusion that Christians don't accept scientific facts, right? And then they're going to give their counterexample. And you'll go back and forth as long as you want with that, just kind of using questions. But really just focus on those first two, on how'd you come to that conclusion and what do you mean by that, to try to see if you can show some of the flaws in the person's challenge. And then after a couple minutes, then you guys just switch roles and do that. And like I said, if you want some challenges, I've got 3 of them here, so you can just raise your hand, let me know, and I can tell it to you. But hopefully you guys can think of 1 or 2 challenges that is just brought against Christians every now and then. So have at it. Take like 2, 3, 4 minutes, something like that. And once you guys feel like you've challenged each other enough, then we can come back. Oh, burden of proof. Sorry. Yeah.
Are really just collected works of lessons that people of the time learned and wanted to write down. And I will say that some friends not being he was saying it in a way like where it was very conversational, so it wasn't like they were debating. The person that he was talking to, the host of the podcast, is not a Christian herself. So it wasn't like they were debating. It was more like said in an academic, he's a doctor, in an academic way, like kind of rather than the average person. That the Bible and all the religious holy books are just collected works of what people learned, lessons learned, and what they want to pass on to humanity. And it's all good stuff, it's just all lessons. Right. So that's the challenge.
It's very good. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think that's a good one. Yeah, what do you mean by religious? Yeah. Okay, so I guess if they were answering, they would probably answer, well, holy books I'm talking about, the Bible completely, he did not mention the Quran. He mentioned what's the Hindu thing? I can't remember what it was. He mentioned Hinduism. I think if he had to go on, he probably would have said Torah, because the host of the podcast was Jewish, so he probably would have mentioned that. And I think she ended up interrupting him, so that was probably the interaction. She kind of guessed at that.
Yeah.
So I guess what do I mean by holy books? I mean the Bible and the Hindu holy book and
So that would mean like,
Called the apostles, set apart from the gospel of God.
how do you that they're all that are collective lessons? I'm not sure. I also be able to answer that.
lessons that we can all learn, which when I hear people say that means they never write a Bible.
Right.
The same thing with the faithful question, it means a person's never written a Bible.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, so I think like,
It does not mean to be.
Actually, and
I'm such a
eventually,
good actor.
well, like, how do
Yes.
like, if they're like, you know, the evidence from.
Well, they contradict each other.
Right, yeah.
I mean, Hinduism, narcissism, so
Right.
it's like the Bible doesn't.
There's other ways.
Right, like it's just, it all, there's like a lot of contradictions, and you know, who they think is God.
Exactly,
You
yeah.
can't say that,
Right,
versus, you know,
Right.
like you're not.
Once you start to really get.
Things that
Like,
agree, and
yeah.
if that's true, because if that was the case, like, from a sociology standpoint, then groups of people kind of would come up with the same type of,
Right.
like, consensus, and they do not agree
Right,
with
yeah,
who God is and
Right.
who we are in relation to God, and
all that.
all of that, and obviously don't agree, so
Yeah.
that's kind of the biggest thing, that they don't agree. Yeah, you know what I mean? So,
Yeah,
that wasn't really to stop a little bit. I also wanted to turn it off at that point. I'm like, you need to continue listening. You have to hear what people say. Yeah.
It's like frustrating.
It is, yeah. I can't listen to stuff like that all the time, but it's,
I'll tell you, yeah, it's an interesting one.
yeah.
Did everyone switch roles?
We're switching now.
Switching now, okay. All right.
Christianity does not respect that. You know, like, there's a lot of people who have like homosexuality, something like that.
Like personal choice stuff? Okay, so, I guess it would be, what do you mean by personal choice?
Choice of how they
So tell me more about, or I guess, I don't want to use evidence because I can't use evidence. I'm trying to think of
That's
evidence. Tell me your reasons why you feel Christians don't respect personal choice. So then we have to specific examples that you have to discuss. Right.
Yeah, it's probably.
That would be where that conversation,
Yeah.
I would conversation would be. I mean, I know that direct answer is the truth from the Bible, but people don't like hearing that.
Right.
That God cares about. You know, that's the way Paul says that a lot. When I talk to him, not that he has debates about that a lot. That like, you know, if you believe that God is all-knowing and all-loving, he would care about every part of your life. He would look at you and what's your feeling, just thinking that.
Yeah.
They do get angry. Well, and that's the main argument nowadays for abortion and pro-choice. Is it's like the women's day, did you see?
All right.
Yeah.
How did everyone feel about that? You get your feet wet a little bit with using Columbo number 1 and Columbo number 2? Yeah? Does it feel like it makes sense, or any questions about kind of using it? Or did you find like maybe you had some difficulty using it with some of the challenges that were brought up? Or just kind of figuring out how do I phrase this? Or anyone like kind of want to bring up something maybe they had difficulty with a little bit? As I've noticed that too. Like I'm like, where exactly do I want to ask what their meaning on? Like I've noticed that with like some of the challenges that are brought up. I'm like, I know how to phrase a Columbo number 2, but not a number 1, or vice versa.
I kind of had that with our, like, I could jump to Columbo number 2 quickly, like, sort of where I wanted to go, but the first
Was difficult.
What was the challenge?
It was, I was saying I heard it on a podcast yesterday when I was listening, where the guy who was speaking, he's a doctor.
Okay.
They weren't debated. He was just saying this as like it's common knowledge type thing. But he said that, well, you know, all the holy books, and he was saying it in a positive way, all the holy books that we have are collected lessons that ancient people groups learned wanted to write it down and pass on to other people.
Okay.
That was the way that he phrased it. And when I said I wanted to turn it off right away.
Yeah.
Not that I don't like listening to debate. I do, but
Yeah.
that wasn't the purpose of this. Like,
So this was just like them, like no one was disagreeing with them, right? This is
no, the person that was talking to him is Jewish.
okay.
And she was kind of pushing him a little bit on things, but it wasn't. I would say she's more universalist than anything,
Okay.
but
Yeah.
she comes from a Jewish background. But anyway, that was what he said, and I was like, so I'm going to give that to her because that's a tough one. I wouldn't know probably what to say in that moment, but Katie did a good job.
So what was did you find a number one in there? Or
I said, what do you mean by holy books?
yes.
Yeah.
There's two actually.
Yeah.
So holy books.
Maybe like, what do you mean by less?
Yes.
Okay.
You
I
want to
thought
know?
of that like later, like holy books was my first thought.
No, and that's probably the one I would start on too, because maybe they accept things that are holy books that you don't. Obviously, I'm sure they do. You don't accept like the Ramayana or whatever as a holy book.
Yeah.
Yeah, so make sure that you understand like which ones they consider to be holy books, which as opposed to which ones not. And then what do they mean by lesson? People love to do that. Like, oh, the Bible's just a bunch of lessons. I'm like, not exactly. I mean, they're, if you're calling doctrines lessons, I guess, but they have serious.
When I hear that, it just means to me. I soften a little bit because it means that they haven't read it.
Yeah.
When they in the fable thing, it just means they haven't read the Bible.
Yeah.
That's not at all what it reads
What it
like.
is.
I mean, there are different instances of lessons, I guess, when Jesus is giving his parables, I guess, but the main lessons in all of them are proving that he is God.
Yes, right.
So it just means that they haven't read it.
Right.
So I kind of come at it with that.
Yeah.
Kind of.
I think that's why it's helpful to know what do they mean by lesson, because I mean, I guess you can qualify like something telling you that Jesus is God. I mean, that is a lesson of sorts, but not like a moral lesson that we typically.
I think that's what he was getting at. Moral lessons that we've all collectively. It's bad to kill people. It's
Yes.
Of course. But the two that he mentioned were the Bible, and then he started talking about Hinduism, and I'm like, that's really odd that you're equating. They're very different religions, very different belief systems.
Right.
I just thought that was fascinating.
Yeah. No, it is.
No, they don't agree with everything. Yeah.
Right.
Our value even is not.
What's that?
Our value, where we get our value as people, is
Yes.
not the same with either religion.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
If I may, just to follow up on what
Yeah.
you're saying, did you say this, what was the form of this?
It was a podcast I was listening to. It was actually a political
Okay.
podcast, so it was kind of out of nowhere that they started talking about that.
So this person,
He's a doctor, so he was.
he's got a doctorate.
Yeah.
So he's on a podcast, he's got credibility because he's got a degree,
Yes.
an advanced degree.
Yes.
Can you imagine how many people he's reaching
I know.
who are not questioning anything he's saying?
I know.
Yeah. I know. And I think.
Just because he's got credibility.
And that is frustrating. And that reminds me of the college that we were talking about, with the professor being at the front of the class. Because I was in situations like that, and I went to a Christian college. Oddly enough, we had debates like that.
That's
Christian
interesting.
college. Yeah, I mean, in a college setting, you absolutely have every right to ask the professor questions because you're paying for that class.
Yeah,
right?
right.
I'm paying you to teach me. But yeah, you're right. You're right. When it's on a podcast like that, and that person is in an authority figure, and yeah.
And is there an ability to interact with the? I don't do podcasts, sorry.
It's more like just a radio program, so not really.
So
Not
nobody gets a chance to ask these questions that we're learning.
Yeah.
In that forum, no.
So
Yeah.
he's unfettered
Yeah.
and he can do lots of influencing.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. And I think what we're trying to show too, I think it was last week that like I said, I just can't remember exactly when we said this, but we talked about something, kind of falling or rising on its own merits, not on something else. Hold on, maybe it's this week I'm supposed to discuss it. Hold on, let me just kind of go through where this is, because I might be bringing this up in future classes. Oh, yeah, you know what? We'll probably get to it next week, so I won't necessarily, take away your surprise. But yeah, we kind of talk about that and how there's this appeal to authority like you're talking about, right? So if an authority figure says it, it must mean it's true, right? Which that's not necessarily true. It's, does the claim or their rationale make sense, right? What are the merits of their rationale? But we live in a culture these days that, if the experts say it, then it must be true. And our job here is to kind of point that I know that so and so said it, but what's their evidence? And you can ask for the authority figures, evidence. You don't necessarily have to ask the person for evidence, but what's the rationale of this person with a doctorate? What's their rationale for coming to this conclusion? Because people with doctorates come to weird conclusions all the time. So, and that's just kind of something maybe you want to highlight with someone like that just always agrees with authority figures. Or the other way that you could go is cite an authority figure that disagrees with them, because there almost always is one, right? There is an authority figure who accepts creationism. There is an authority figure there are many Christians with doctorates whether it's a doctorate in apologetics or whatever, or biblical theology, that will disagree with them. And so if they try to play that game of citing authority figures, then you can do the same. You can play that game too. So we will end there because it's 10:01. So let me just pray our way out of here, and we'll head up to worship. So thank you, Lord, for bringing us into your house again, and to just learn a little bit more about using Columbo number 2, right? We're always just trying to make a defense for our hope that is in you, not in a combative manner, but always in a gentle and respectful manner with those who ask us. And it's in your blessed name that we pray. Amen.